The house was silent, except for the crackling of the old stove and the muffled sound of a song that escaped from a forgotten earphone on the table. She spun alone in the kitchen, her bare feet on the cold floor, smiling into the void as if someone were watching her. It was her habit to dance like that in the early hours of the morning, among the pots and pans drying and the towels drying. But that night, while the soup boiled and the radio whispered, he came in. He watched, and without saying anything, he took her hand. One step, two, a gentle turn. Time stopped for seconds that she would remember forever. The next day, his bed was too made. His car was no longer in the garage, and his name was never spoken out loud again. It was just a simple moment, almost invisible to anyone else. But for her, that last shared step on the stained kitchen floor was the silent confession he never had the courage to make. He was the boss, she, the maid, and there was a line they both knew not to cross until for a moment they forgot about it. What he took from that house no one knew, but what he left behind remained forever in her body, in her soul, and in a note hidden between the pages of a cookbook. Fate would come looking for answers years later, when the past returned in the form of an unknown young man with the same eyes as his. If this story has already caught your attention in the first few seconds, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It makes all the difference in helping more people find stories like this. The Harrison kitchen always seemed bigger in the early hours of the morning. No voices, no hurried footsteps, no orders. Just her and the muffled sound of the wall clock ticking away time that wasn't hers. Clara would arrive earlier than she should have, or stay longer than she needed to, just to have that moment. The wooden floor creaked under her bare feet, and her worn apron swirled with her like a silent bridal veil. She danced with her arms, raised, imagining herself light, free, as if each wooden spoon were a partner who would never let her fall. The dim light over the sink gave a golden hue to her dark skin that rarely saw the sun. No one ever knew, but it was there, among the pots and pans and leftovers from dinner, that Clara allowed herself to exist without fear. She danced as if she were truly alive, and not just serving a life that wasn't hers. On the other side of the house, he also woke up early. Ethan Harrison was a man of deep silences and looks that rarely revealed what he was feeling. He was never rude to her, but he was never too kind either. It was as if he knew that any gesture outside of protocol could be misinterpreted. Clara always respected that. The invisible barrier between employer and employee was maintained rigorously, but there were days when she felt something different in his eyes. A second too long, a look that he looked away too late. And then the silence returned, as if nothing had happened. She pretended not to notice. He pretended not to feel. And so the days went by. That night, however, there was something different. Maybe it was the smell of the rain beating on the roof, or the old radio that was playing a slow song from the 60s. Clara was spinning with a spoon in her hand, quietly singing lyrics that only she knew. Her eyes were closed, her smile discreet, her heart open like a window. When she opened her eyes, he was there, leaning against the door, with his arms crossed and an indecipherable expression. She froze. The spoon fell to the floor with a small noise that echoed more than it should have. The silence between them was long, until he took a step, then another. He stopped in front of her, held out his hand, and without saying a word, he pulled her to dance. It was just a turn. One step to the left, another to the right. He held her gently, as if he were afraid of breaking her. Her heart was racing. She tried not to tremble. It was like daydreaming. Time seemed suspended. The music, the smell of the soup, his breath, the warmth of that hand, it all became a single moment. When the song ended, he just smiled slightly, let go of her hand, and left the room without looking back. Clara stood there, her chest full and her legs weak, not knowing if it had been real. The next morning his bed was made. The clothes in the closet were gone. The car was gone. No letter, no explanation, no goodbye. Clara waited all day, Then another week. She called the lady of the house, who also didn't know anything. He had to go away, was all they said. But inside her, something screamed that this wasn't just a trip, it was an escape, and perhaps a cowardice. She never saw him again. But she never danced alone in the same way again. The weeks that followed were filled with silences heavier than the day's tasks. Clara remained in the house, but everything seemed still, suspended, as if the place had lost its breath. The Harrisons did not return. A lawyer came by one afternoon and informed her that the house was being sold and that she would receive the agreed payment for the last few days. He said this while looking at his own papers, without even asking if she was okay. Clara nodded her thanks, gathered her things into 2 small bags, and looked one last time at the kitchen, the pan marks on the wall, the cracked plates on the shelf, the apron hanging behind the door. She did not cry, but her fingers lingered a few seconds longer on the light switch before she turned it off and left without making a sound. Over the next few years, Clara lived in a succession of different houses and floors. None of them smelled like that kitchen, none of them had the old radio, and none of them had Ethan's restrained gaze hovering over the room. She worked for families with children, elderly people, and lonely women, and in all of them she maintained a discreet, efficient, invisible routine, as was expected. But she never danced again. Even in the rare moments when she was alone, even when some familiar music played in the distance, something inside her stopped her. Her body felt too heavy, as if that single turn had exhausted all the movements she was allowed to move in life. She tried to move on. She learned to sew, started doing small repairs for her neighbors, sold cakes on the weekends. But with each new step she took, there was a part of her that remained attached to that nameless night, to the light touch of his hand and the sound of that song. Not because of romance, not because of hope, but because in that moment she had felt seen. For the first time in her erased existence, someone had stopped to dance with her, and that hurt more than the absence. Time, however, teaches us to keep certain pains like photographs. Clara aged with dignity. She never married. She never told anyone about Ethan. But once, when asked if she had ever loved anyone, she smiled sadly and answered, "Just enough to dance for 2 seconds." The person she was talking to didn't understand, but she didn't explain. She kept that painful and beautiful secret to herself like a cracked jewel. Sometimes, when she was tidying drawers or washing dishes, she would catch herself remembering the way he breathed near her, the warmth of his hand, the way he carefully released her fingers, and she would return to the present with a short sigh, followed by silence. One rainy morning, Clara received an unexpected phone call. A young, polite voice with an indeterminate accent asked for her. "Are you Clara Alvarez? Did you work at the Harrison house many years ago?" She hesitated. Then she nodded. The voice thanked her and simply said, "I wanted to meet you. My name is Daniel." And before she could ask any more questions, the line was disconnected. 2 days later, Daniel showed up. He was a tall, thin boy with eyes the same shade she had never forgotten, a brown that seemed to contain the entire autumn. He was carrying a worn backpack, a respectful expression on his face, and an envelope in his hands. She recognized him before he even said anything, not by his name, not by his clothes, but by the way he remained silent, by the way he looked around, unhurriedly, as if he were listening to things no one else was. Clara invited him in. She made coffee as she always did, her hands shaking slightly. He sat at the kitchen table as if he were familiar with the place, even though he had never been there. For long minutes, neither of them said a word, until he took a faded photograph from his jacket pocket. It was her younger laughing in the kitchen of the Harrison house, holding a dish with a flowered cloth. The photo had been taken from a distance, without her noticing. In the bottom corner, handwritten, "The woman who danced when no one was looking." She put her hand to her mouth, startled. Daniel then held out the envelope. Inside was a yellowed letter. The handwriting was his, Ethan's, the same one she recognized from the labels in the pantry, from the notes to the supermarket. With trembling hands she began to read. Clara, if you're reading this, it's because I'm no longer here. I've always been weak with words, especially the ones that mattered the most. But you deserve to know. I left that morning because I lacked courage, and I never came back because I thought it wouldn't be fair to you. But the truth is that there wasn't a single day that went by that I didn't remember your laughter in that kitchen. You dancing with the pots and pans and the light in your eyes. It was like watching time stand still. I was a coward, but I kept you in the noblest part of my memory. When I got sick, I thought the least I could do was tell my son about the woman who, for one night, taught me what love was without demanding anything. If he reached you, it is because he chose to know this part of me, and because he carries within himself the only thing I inherited from you, the silent hope that a gesture can last a lifetime. Ethan. Clara's tears were not loud. They fell quietly like everything else about her. Daniel bowed his head in respect, his eyes welling up too. Then he pulled a small, old-fashioned radio from his backpack. It was the same one she had used in the Harrisons' kitchen. He said his father had kept it by his bedside, and that for the last few months of his life he had played one song over and over again. He pressed the button, and the melody filled the air, the same soft waltz from the night Ethan had danced with her. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This was not just a memory, it was a return, a farewell, that time finally allowed. She looked at Daniel tenderly. There was the same gentle hesitation in him, the same respect, the same meaningful silence. And then, for the first time in decades, she stood up. She let the radio play, and she began to spin slowly, alone, as before. But when she offered her hand to Daniel, he held it firmly. They didn't need to say anything. The dance once again spoke for them. That night, Clara slept with her eyes still wet, but with her heart lighter than she had ever remembered. It was as if something that had been suspended for so many years had finally found its way to the ground. In the days that followed, Daniel appeared more often. He brought stories of his father, doubts, memories that had been shattered. He wanted to understand who that man had been before he was his father, and the only person who could fill that void was her. They sat at the kitchen table for hours, Clara carefully sorting through memories like someone handling ancient crystals. She spoke little, but truthfully. She told him about Ethan's quiet ways, about the notes he left on the table, about the way he rolled up his shirt sleeves whenever he was uncomfortable. She told him about the mornings he would forget to put the coffee on the stove while he read old newspapers, and about the respectful silence he always had for her, as if he knew she held a whole world inside her. But she didn't mention the dance or the ticket, or the emptiness that was left behind. She felt like it was a secret that should remain hers. Daniel seemed to understand, even without knowing it. He observed the details of the environment, as if searching for traces of his father in the shadows. He asked respectfully, listened attentively, and, little by little, he created a new space in Clara's life. A calm, unhurried space, where words had time to be born. One afternoon, Clara asked him why he had decided to look for her. Daniel hesitated. He said he had found a locked box in his father's office after his death. Inside were a few things: her photograph, the radio, the letter, and a loose sheet of paper with the following handwritten sentence. If I had danced sooner, maybe she would have stayed. He said that it had stayed with him ever since, and that he needed to understand what his father had meant. Clara didn't answer right. Away. She looked out the window where the sun filtered through the worn curtains. Then, with a fragile smile, she simply said, "Some dances are eternal, even if they last for seconds," and she let the silence complete the sentence. It was that same week that Daniel returned with an invitation. He was moving to another city, starting a new job, but first he wanted her to accompany him to a special place. It took them 3 hours to get there. It was a bare hill where the Harrisons had a small family cemetery. At the top was a simple headstone with Ethan's name carved without fanfare. Daniel knelt and placed a small portable radio on the grass. He pressed the button, the same song, the same waltz. The sound carried on the wind like an ancient call. Clara stood firm, but inside she felt her knees shaking. It was as if time was pushing her back into that memory. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, Daniel held out his hand. She didn't hesitate. There in front of the silent tombstone they danced, slowly, as if settling accounts with time. A pure gesture without words. Clara was no longer dancing alone, and in that moment, everything that was left unsaid, finally, rested. Time passed more gently after that afternoon on the hill. Clara returned home with her heart silent, but it was a different kind of silence, no longer the kind that hides pain, but rather the kind that holds gratitude. Daniel's steps left a good mark on her routine. Even after moving, he called her every week, sent letters with photos of the new cities he visited, recipes he wanted to learn, and even little notes like his father used to make. "Today I saw a lady dancing alone at the fair. I thought of you," one of them said, accompanied by a dry leaf between the pages. Clara smiled as she reread each sentence as if they were little gifts from the past, asking permission to stay. She returned to sewing with greater enthusiasm. She accepted the church's invitation to teach embroidery to the girls in the neighborhood. And one night, when the local radio played an old song by chance, she got up from the couch and allowed herself a shy spin in the middle of the living room. No one saw her, but this time she was no longer dancing out of loneliness. She was dancing out of memory. The memory of Ethan no longer hurt her. It simply lived inside her like an aged painting on a wall where the sun shines. A month later, she received another visit. A mailman left a hand-addressed brown package, no return address. When she opened it, she found an old, hard-cover navy blue notebook. It was Ethan's diary. The first few pages were blank, as if he had thought too much before starting. But there, between one entry and another, Clara found sentences scattered like pieces of a soul. "Today she sang a song I don't know softly. Her voice is what keeps me from running away. I bought flowers for my mother, but I wish I had the courage to give them to Clara. She danced again. My God, how she dances! How come no one sees this?" Clara closed the diary to her chest. She cried for the first time in many months, not out of regret nor out of desire, but because, after all, she discovered that that love had not been just hers. It had also existed on his side, even if hidden, even if cornered by conventions, fears, and silences. One Sunday, during tea with her sewing students, one of the girls asked, "Have you ever been truly loved?" Clara replied sweetly, "Yes, for a moment, but it was enough to last a lifetime." The girls laughed, thinking it was a metaphor, but Clara knew it was literal. And so, between lines, ties, and memories, the days went by. She no longer waited for anyone. But she didn't feel alone either. I had a world saved in letters, songs, memories, and small gestures that no one else would understand. And sometimes, at the end of the day, I would pick up the old radio, put on the waltz, and let my body remember what my heart no longer needed to forget. It was on a blue afternoon, one of those when the wind comes gently through the cracks, that Clara decided to open the wooden box she had kept under her bed since she left the Harrison house. Inside, there were small objects of no value to anyone else: a worn wooden spoon, a napkin embroidered with the letter E, a red satin ribbon that he had once dropped without noticing. Ordinary things, but for her, they held more history than any. Portrait. That day, something in her told her it was time to give back to the world what she had kept for so long, not as a loss, but as a sharing. She wrote a letter. It was short, simple, without embellishments. She wrote to Daniel. She told him about the dance, about the only time their bodies had met, about the music that hung like perfume in the air, and about the way he had left the next day. She wrote not because she needed a response, but because she wanted her son to know that, despite his absence, there had been a moment of truth between them, a moment that she had protected with her own life. Days later, Daniel called. His voice was shaky but firm. He said he read the letter 3 times before he could digest what it meant. He said he paced around his room holding his father's pen, trying to find the words, but all he could say was, "Thank you, for not demanding anything from him, for loving me anyway." Those words echoed inside Clara, like a liberation, as if, finally, someone saw her not just as the woman who danced alone, but as the woman who loved without ever being invited to love. Daniel, with his quiet sweetness, elevated her to a place that not even she knew she deserved to occupy, that of someone who was part of a bigger story, even without having officially signed any chapter. It was around these days that she returned to the Harrison house. The property was now abandoned, windows broken, the gardens swallowed up by weeds. But the structure remained. Clara walked carefully among the rubble. She reached the kitchen. The tiles had holes, the floor was damp, but the counter was still the same. She closed her eyes and could almost hear the clanking of the pots, the sound of the spoon falling, his breathing on her back. With slow steps, she did the same turn she had practiced so many times alone. And there, in the center of abandonment, she smiled. Because now, there was no more pain, only memory. The symbolic gesture of the dance was no longer a lament. It was gratitude. On the way home, Clara stopped at a flower shop. She bought a small jasmine plant, Ethan's mother's favorite flower, something he had mentioned only once, but which she had never forgotten. She planted it in the garden in front of the living room window. Every time she looked at it, she was reminded that even roots that grow in silence can blossom. It was on a warm, windy night that Clara, no longer burdened by the years that would not return, sat on the floor of her room and pulled out the wooden box hidden under her bed. It was the same box she had carried from house to house, unopened, like someone carrying a secret locked away in their own hands. Inside were small relics that were valuable only to her: a worn wooden spoon, the napkin embroidered with the letter E that she had found in the Harrisons' kitchen, and a red satin ribbon that he had dropped one night while folding the newspapers. That was all that was left, and at the same time, it was all she needed. For the first time, he did not put the objects back. Instead, he wrote her a letter. It was a short, undramatic letter, direct as always, addressed to Daniel. In it, she told him about the dance. Not in great detail, but enough for him to understand. She told him about the restrained moment, the hand that pulled her, the body that turned hers without words. She told him about the silence of the next day and how she never danced the same way again. She ended with a simple sentence. It was just a moment, but it was mine. 2 days later, the phone rang. Daniel's voice was low and emotional. He said he read the letter 3 times before he could breathe properly. He said he cried without understanding why, and that, after pacing around the room for a long time, all he could say was, "Thank you." A long silence hung between them until Daniel added, "For not asking for anything in return, for loving you the way you did." Those words opened something inside Clara, as if, finally, someone saw what she had always been, the woman who loved in the dark, who danced without an audience, who accepted losing without ever demanding anything in return. For the first time, she felt that this invisible love had been validated, not by the man who had left, but by the son who had inherited his sensitivity without his fears. That same week, Clara returned to the old house. The Harrison property was now a ruin and silence. She walked through tall weeds, broken windows, and peeling walls. The kitchen was still standing. The old radio was broken in a corner. The floor was dirty but firm. Clara walked in slowly. She stood silently and spun around. Just one spin, just like before. This time, it didn't hurt. This time, it wasn't longing or regret. It was a dance of gratitude, a settling of accounts with time. On the way home, she stopped at a flower shop and bought a jasmine plant. She planted it in front of the living room window. Jasmine, Ethan's mother's favorite flower, a detail he had mentioned only once, but which she had never forgotten. And each time the plant grew, Clara saw something in it that she understood better than anyone. Even that which grows in silence can blossom with beauty. In the weeks that followed, Clara began to care for the jasmine as if she were keeping a promise. She always watered it at the same time, pruned it gently, and spoke softly to the leaves, as if each flower that bloomed was a piece of the past that was finally blooming in peace. The soft perfume filled the house and mixed with the smell of fresh coffee, of freshly ironed clothes, of memories that now came without pain. It was as if that plant translated everything she had never been able to say, not with words, but with silence. Daniel was still there, sometimes with long letters full of stories about his new job, sometimes with cards containing a single sentence. In one of them, he sent a dried leaf glued to thick paper and wrote, "She danced as if she were praying." Clara read it and remained silent for several minutes. Then she put the note inside the old cookbook that had belonged to Ethan's mother, now displayed on the table as if it were a sacred relic. In the following days, she began to remake the recipes in the book one by one, as if searching for in the flavors parts of the man she had once loved, even though she had not been loved in return the way she deserved. It was during one of those quiet afternoons, while the apple and cinnamon cake was baking in the oven, that he heard the doorbell ring. When he opened the door, he found a young woman with curly hair tied in a high bun, her eyes shining with expectation, and a worn backpack on her shoulders. "Are you Clara?" he asked in a firm voice. Clara nodded. "My name is Anna. Daniel sent me. He said you teach more than just sewing." There was something in Anna's eyes that Clara recognized, a restlessness disguised as courage, a rush to learn about life as if she feared it would pass her by without explanation. She brought with her too many questions, open wounds, and a timid hope of finding a place where she could be seen without judgment. Clara welcomed her without making a fuss. She offered tea, thread, fabrics, and silence. The following afternoons were spent with needles and words. Clara taught how to thread the thread calmly, gently corrected the stitches, and between one seam and another, she let stories slip out. Never as a lament, always as a journey. Anna listened attentively, as someone who knows that there is wisdom in what is not said. One of those afternoons, Clara commented on the dance. Not directly. She simply said with a restrained smile, "There are times when the body remembers what the soul has forgotten." Anna wanted to know more, but Clara changed the subject lightly, like someone who keeps something precious not out of pain, but out of love. In the spring, Anna came back from the street with tears in her eyes. She had gotten a scholarship to study abroad. She was happy but scared. Clara hugged her tightly and simply said, "Go, and when you dance, dance for me too." And so once again, Clara stood before an open door. But this time, he didn't feel lonely. He felt continuity, because every time someone left, they took a little bit of that woman who danced alone in the kitchen with them. And they left, in return, the certainty that she was never invisible. She was just too big to be noticed by small eyes. Time, which once seemed to weigh on Clara's shoulders like an unfulfilled promise, now only blew lightly. The mornings were quiet. The old radio still whispered soft melodies, and the jasmine bloomed firmly in the living room window, spreading its sweet scent throughout the house. Clara walked slowly, in no hurry to get anywhere. Every corner of the house held a memory, a detail, an old breath, and the silence which had once hurt now felt like company. A good silence of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. It was one of those mornings that Daniel called. He said he would stop by before he moved again. He wanted to see Clara, to see the woman who, without knowing it, had reconstructed parts of him. Clara made a simple cake, put the teapot on the stove, and set the table with the notes he had sent her over the years. When he arrived, he was carrying a small, dark wooden box. He said it was the last thing he had found of his father. He gave it to her, as if he were handing over an inheritance that needs to find rest. Inside the box was an old pocket watch. It was stuck at 7-Eleven. Next to it was a short note, written in a handwriting Clara would never forget. "That was the moment everything changed for me." She didn't need to ask. She knew. It was the exact moment Ethan had silently taken her hand and spun her around the kitchen. A single moment, an entire eternity. Clara closed her eyes and held the watch to her chest. She felt as if all of time fit. Go there between those still hands, and the scent of jasmine coming from the window. In that simple gesture there was more than remembrance. There was acceptance. There was beauty. There was forgiveness. Daniel didn't say anything. He just came closer and placed his hand on her shoulder with the same delicacy as his father. And it was like that, in silence, that they said goodbye to that old pain. That night, Daniel slept in the guest room. Clara sat in the living room by the window, listening to the sounds of dawn. She looked around the house, now full of stories that had seemed empty before. She remembered the dance, the escape, the letters, the son who had returned, the girl who had sown with hope. Everything now seemed to make sense, as if each absence had found its place. The next morning, Clara made coffee and called Daniel to the table. She handed him an envelope. "It's your turn to keep a story," she said. Inside was the red ribbon Ethan had dropped so many years ago. Daniel held it reverently, his eyes brimming with tears. Before he left, he turned and asked, "Would you dance again?" Clara smiled with her eyes. She walked over to the radio, turned the knob, and the same song filled the room. She held out her hand to Daniel. He took it, and they danced, a single turn. But this time, her eyes weren't on the past, they were firmly on the now, because some loves don't need to come back to be complete. They just need to be recognized, felt, honored, and then we moved on. As the months passed, Clara began receiving small notes discreetly left under her door. Some were signed, some unsigned. One said, "I saw you dancing through the window. I will never forget." Another had only a crude drawing of a flower with the word strength next to it. One day she found a blue envelope with childish handwriting. "You look like a fairy tale." She kept them all in a shoebox, not sure who was sending them. But she knew. Her story was spreading, not through the words she spoke, but through the actions she inspired. She spent more time at the window now. She watched the streets, the footsteps, the looks. She noticed how people were in a hurry, and at the same time, how much they missed stopping. One late afternoon, she saw a young couple dancing on the sidewalk to the sound of a cell phone. They didn't know each other, but they were both laughing and spinning as if that was all the world was. Clara couldn't help but smile, because in that moment she recognized something that she had once lived, and that was now being reborn in other bodies, in other stories. It was during this same period that Anna returned, more mature, with firm eyes and a wide smile. He was on vacation and wanted to visit Clara before anything else. He brought flowers, stories of the new city, and, in an almost ceremonial gesture, a pair of slippers. "I never got to wear them," he said, "but maybe they were made for your feet." Clara held the gift as if it were too fragile for the world, and there in silence, the two hugged for a long time as if no time had passed. Anna stayed for a few days, and one calm night, the two went to the neighborhood square. There was a small group of young people playing the violin. When a familiar melody began to play, Anna took Clara's hand. She hesitated, but she went. In the middle of the square, under the eyes of a few and the caress of the wind, they danced. One slowly, the other firmly. One step at a time. There was no audience, no cell phones. Just the moment. And Clara once again allowed herself to spin, not in memory but in presence. Back home they sat on the couch in silence. Anna held Ethan's old diary, which Clara finally decided to show her. "He didn't know how to dance with me while he was alive," she said, "but he taught me how to dance after he was gone." Anna smiled, touched. So he did dance, in his own way. Before leaving, Anna wrote a phrase on the mirror in the guest room with red lipstick. "Be the sound that is." Missing for someone to dance. Clara read it for days. She didn't erase it. On the contrary, she started writing phrases on the notes she left in coat pockets at the thrift store, inside books at the library, or hidden on benches in the park. Words like "dance even if no one is watching," or "sometimes love comes silently and turns you around completely." She didn't expect answers. She just wanted to give back to the world what she had received. A moment of beauty in the midst of the ordinary. Autumn arrived, dropping golden leaves onto the sidewalk in front of Clara's small house. The jasmine no longer bloomed as vigorously, but it still held on, holding onto its stem the memory of everything that had grown there. Clara walked more slowly now, She used a cane, yes, but she made a point of making her own tea, opening the windows in the morning and listening to the radio, even though her ears could no longer hear the notes as they used to. The city seemed to have slowed down with her, and there was something beautiful about that. One afternoon, as she was returning from the market, she noticed a poster taped to a lamppost in the square. It was an announcement for a community event called The Last Dance. A group of young people were hosting a night of music to celebrate the city's forgotten stories. There was a blank space for nominations. Clara, without thinking much, wrote a name, Ethan Harrison, and below it, a brief sentence. He danced with me once, and that was enough to change everything. On the night of the event, the square was filled with soft lights, scattered chairs, and a small improvised stage. Clara arrived accompanied by a neighbor. She sat in the corner as usual. She observed everything calmly. When Ethan's name was announced, the sound in the square fell silent. A young woman with a firm and emotional voice read Clara's note aloud, and as the waltz began to play, a couple stood up and danced in the center, with slow and simple movements. Clara cried silently. A lady who was standing nearby asked, "Was he your husband?" Clara smiled and replied, "No, but he was my eternal moment." The woman squeezed her hand, without saying anything, and in that gesture there was understanding. Because not all love needs to last a lifetime to be love, and not all dances need to be long to be unforgettable. After that night, Clara began to be sought after. Young people knocked on her door asking for advice. Others simply sat and listened to the radio with her in silence. Some left notes with short phrases, inspired by those she herself had spread around the city. She became a legend without realizing it. But he never felt bigger than he was. He would say simply, "I'm just someone who danced once and who hasn't forgotten how to do it." But time, as always, doesn't wait. Some mornings were colder, some nights were longer. Clara started going to bed earlier. She slept with the radio on. She spoke little, but smiled like someone who knows she has lived long enough to be remembered with sweetness. Then one day the neighbor noticed that the window hadn't opened in the morning. She went in. She found Clara on the couch. She seemed to be asleep. The radio was still playing softly. The red ribbon was tightly wrapped around her wrist. The recipe book was open on her lap. And above it, a final note. "I danced until the end." The funeral was simple, as she would have wished, but the square was full. Daniel came from far away. So did Anna. Each one carrying a fragment left by Clara, a note, a piece of advice, a memory. And there, among flowers and songs, everyone understood that some loves are like old music. No matter how much time passes, there will always be someone willing to dance when it plays again. Months after Clara's goodbye, the little house remained as she had left it. The neighbor who had found her on the couch now tended the garden with silent affection, watering the jasmine that, against the odds, had bloomed again. It was as if the plant knew that there was still something to give. Inside the house, nothing had been moved. The red ribbon rested in a photo frame next to the old radio, which continued to play on Sundays. Sometimes it was said that the neighbors could still hear her whispering softly when the music started, as if she were there, spinning with her eyes closed. Daniel returned to town unannounced. He walked slowly across the square, where a small bronze plaque now stood, bearing the name Clara's Waltz Square. Children ran among the trees, couples lay on the grass, and street musicians played soft songs. But he had not come just to visit. He carried with him a sealed envelope, one that his father, Ethan, had left to be delivered only when everything could no longer fit in my chest. Inside was a sheet of paper, just one, handwritten in a shaky handwriting. "If you still dance when I'm gone, then you understand me. I haven't gone away. I've become music." As Daniel read it, he sat down in the shade of the jasmine and cried with his face in his hands. For the first time he understood the fullness of the love his father had felt. It wasn't courage that Ethan lacked. It was time. It was freedom. It was the absence of a world where that love could fit. And Clara. Clara had been the only stage where Ethan dared to dance completely, even if only for a moment. Little by little, the square changed. Its official name became Waltz Square. Young people organized small dance nights. Anyone could participate, no matter their age, their steps, or whether they had a partner. All they had to do was want to dance. It was a tribute that carried no pomp, just truth, born from a tiny gesture between a wooden spoon and an old radio. A silent movement started by a woman no one saw, until the whole world began to hear her. Anna returned to the city as well. She opened a small studio, sewing light dresses, and each one wore a discreet red bow hand-sewn on the hem. When asked why, she would smile and say, "To remind us that everything starts with a small gesture." On the white wall in the studio, there was a framed painting with a phrase written in lipstick: "Be the sound that is missing for someone to dance." One day at a local school, a girl asked her teacher who Clara had been, and the answer came simple, serene, like everything Clara was. She was a woman who danced alone for a long time, until the world decided to listen to her music. And, the child smiled as if that were enough. The story that began with a silent dance in a kitchen full of pots and pans crossed generations without anyone asking for it. It didn't become news, but it became a memory. Clara didn't leave behind an inheritance, nor an important surname, but she left behind something that time cannot corrode, the memory that loves that are not fulfilled can still be eternal, and that dancing alone is not loneliness, it is courage. And so, the radio continues to play. On Sundays, the red ribbon, now a symbol of the city, appears on clothes, drawings, and even in discreet tattoos. The old music? It lives in hearts that may not even know where it came from, but they feel it, because love, when it dances, doesn't end. It just changes rhythm, and the red ribbon on the city's pulse keeps spinning.